This is a story I've kept buried for nearly a decade. It happened when I was 27, an age where you still have that dangerous, misplaced overconfidence in your own physical endurance and survival skills. Back then, I regularly went on solo backpacking trips deep into old-growth forests where few people ever set foot. I loved the feeling of being completely detached from civilization. No cell service, no traffic, just me and the raw wilderness. My friends used to call me crazy for wandering into the middle of nowhere alone, and looking back now, they were probably right. This particular trip took place in the Bitterroot National Forest in Montana, around late October. My plan was to hike about 15 miles deep into the backcountry, camp for 2 nights, and loop back out. Everything during the first day went perfectly. The sky was a crisp, clear blue. The autumn air was biting but refreshing, and I didn't cross paths with a single other hiker. It was exactly the kind of isolation I craved. But Mother Nature at high altitudes is never predictable. Around 3 p.m. on the second day, thick, bruised clouds began rolling in over the ridge. The temperature plummeted so fast, I could see my breath turning into thick white plumes. At first, I thought it was just a passing autumn shower, but I was wrong. The wind began to howl through the pines, bending small trees and ripping dead branches that crashed to the forest floor. Then came the precipitation, not just rain, but freezing sleet mixed with jagged snowflakes. The bone-chilling cold soaked right through my waterproof shell, biting into my skin. Within minutes, I was drenched and shivering violently. Anyone who has spent time in the woods knows that hypothermia can kill you much faster than any wild animal. I knew I couldn't pitch a tent in the middle of this raging storm. I needed to find solid shelter immediately. I stumbled off the main trail, desperately looking for a rock overhang or a cave. And then, through the blinding white sheet of freezing rain, I faintly made out a gray wooden structure sitting in a small clearing, surrounded by dead pines. It looked like an old, abandoned logging or hunting shack from decades ago. I pushed myself to the absolute limit, using whatever strength I had left to run toward it. The cabin was incredibly dilapidated, with a rusted tin roof and rotting wooden walls. Without hesitating, I shoved my shoulder against the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The moment the door shut behind me, cutting off the deafening roar of the wind, I let out a massive sigh of relief. Inside, it was pitch black and smelled overwhelmingly of mildew, damp earth, and rotting wood, but at least it was dry. Survival mode overrode any sense of caution. I quickly dropped my heavy pack, stripped off my freezing wet clothes, threw on my dry thermal spares, and huddled inside my sleeping bag to regain my body heat. It took nearly an hour for my uncontrollable shivering to stop. As the storm continued to rage outside, my curiosity began to creep back in. I pulled out my small tactical flashlight and started scanning the room to get a better look at my sanctuary. The cabin was a single, claustrophobic room. There was no real furniture, just an old, rotting wooden table, an empty, rusted drum in the corner, and a few things that felt entirely out of place in this abandoned ruin. The beam of my flashlight froze. Sitting neatly on the decaying table was a brand new pack of candles, a few commercial bottles of water, and a roll of silver duct tape. In the corner, it wasn't a torn-up cot like I originally thought, but a fully inflated air mattress. My heart skipped a beat. Someone was actively using this place. This wasn't just a hunter occasionally dropping by. Someone was using this as a hidden base camp. But the thing that sent a true, paralyzing chill down my spine wasn't the supplies. When I shined my light on the wooden wall right next to the front door, my stomach dropped into a bottomless pit. The wood was covered in hundreds of deep, frantic scratch marks. They weren't made by an animal, because mixed into the gouges were dark, dried brown stains, looking exactly like dried blood from fingernails that had been torn back in absolute desperation. My breath hitched in my throat. I immediately aimed my flashlight at the cabin's only window. There was no glass. It was boarded up with a thick plank of wood. But the terrifying part was that the heavy screws holding it in place had been drilled in from the outside. I rushed to the front door, my trembling hand feeling the doorknob. It was just a smooth handle. There was no deadbolt, no lock on the inside. Instead, I saw 4 massive metal bolts punched through the wood from the exterior, a clear sign that a heavy-duty locking mechanism was installed on the outside of the door. This place wasn't a shelter from the storm. It was a holding cell. Someone had been locked in here, clawing at the walls in the pitch black until their fingers bled. Every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to run. But outside, the sleet was still coming down in sheets, and thunder was cracking across the sky. Running blindly into the freezing, pitch-black woods was a death sentence. I tried to rationalize with myself. Whoever used this place couldn't possibly hike out here in a storm this severe. I decided to drag the heavy wooden table against the door, grip my hunting knife tightly in my hand, and stay awake all night until first light, when I would immediately leave. But I drastically underestimated the madness of whoever lurked in those deep woods. Around 2 a.m., the sound of the rain hitting the tin roof seemed to soften just a bit, and in that brief window of relative silence, I heard it. Crunch, crunch, footsteps. Not the light, stealthy steps of an animal, but the heavy, deliberate tread of leather boots crushing the wet pine needles, walking directly toward the cabin. My blood turned to ice. I held my breath, shrinking into the darkest corner of the room, gripping the handle of my knife so hard my knuckles turned white. The footsteps stepped up onto the rotting wooden porch. Creak, creak. There was a person standing just inches away on the other side of that door. I could hear the wet rustling of a raincoat in the wind and a slow, steady breathing. Suddenly, the doorknob was violently twisted. It clicked loudly, but the door didn't budge thanks to the heavy table I had wedged against it. The person outside stopped. A suffocating, agonizing silence stretched between us. He knew someone was inside. He knew the door was barricaded. If it were a normal hiker seeking shelter from the storm, they would have knocked or yelled out. But this guy didn't. He didn't say a single word. His silence felt calculated, drenched in malice. Then, I heard the footsteps back away. He stepped off the porch. My heart nearly leaped out of my chest, hoping he had given up. But no. Seconds later, I heard the clanking of metal, followed by the sound of a very heavy, thick wooden beam being dragged across the mud. He stepped back onto the porch. Thwack, thwack, thwack. A deafening, violent sound echoed through the tiny cabin, making me jump. He was using a sledgehammer, driving massive iron nails through a thick wooden plank, securing the door directly into the frame. Thwack, thwack, thwack. He wasn't trying to break in. He was methodically boarding up the only exit. He was sealing me inside. Pure, unadulterated panic exploded in my chest, shattering any restraint I had left. The front door was no longer an option. I frantically scrambled to the back wall of the cabin, using my bare hands and my knife to pry at the rotting wooden panels near the floor. The wood was already water damaged, and fueled by absolute desperation, I slashed, kicked, and stomped until I forced a gap just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Just as the hammering outside stopped, I heard the unmistakable glugging sound of liquid being poured over the wooden porch. The potent, dizzying stench of gasoline flooded the cabin. I dove headfirst through the gap, dropping straight into the freezing, wet mud outside. I didn't dare stand up. I army crawled like a centipede, dragging my body deep into the thickest, darkest brush about 20 feet away. Through the freezing rain, I saw the silhouette of a tall man wearing a black raincoat, the hood pulled up to conceal his face. He calmly struck a match and tossed it onto the porch. A sharp whoosh pierced the night. Bright orange flames erupted, engulfing the entire front of the cabin in a matter of seconds. The firelight revealed a massive, X-shaped wooden beam nailed securely across the door. The man just stood there, arms crossed, calmly watching the inferno consume the structure, entirely convinced I was screaming to death inside. I didn't dare breathe heavily, let alone move a single muscle. The freezing mud was nothing compared to the chilling cruelty radiating from the man standing before me. Only when the flames roared high into the canopy, and he finally turned to walk away into the deep woods, did I dare to slowly back up. Once I was far enough, I turned and sprinted blindly into the dark. I don't know how long I ran, how many times I tripped, or how much my skin was torn by unseen branches. I just kept running until my legs went entirely numb, and the gray light of dawn finally began to pierce through the trees. I stumbled upon an old logging road, and miraculously encountered a park ranger's patrol truck around noon. When I led the authorities back to the cabin's location the next day, there was nothing left but a charred, blackened square of ash. In the debris, they found the melted remains of iron chains and a few bone fragments, though they couldn't immediately confirm if they were animal or human. The arsonist was never found, leaving no trace behind except the ashes. To this day, whenever I'm lying in my warm, secure bedroom and hear the rain tapping against the window pane, a cold shiver still runs down my spine. I always catch myself wondering, what would have happened that night if I had been a heavy sleeper and never heard those boots step onto that rotting wooden porch? I was 19, a broke college student drowning in tuition loans. When I was offered an overnight babysitting gig that paid triple my usual rate, I agreed instantly, without a second thought. Looking back, it was the stupidest decision of my life. The location was a stunning modern glass house, but it sat completely isolated on a densely forested hillside on the edge of the Tillamook State Forest in Oregon. There were no neighbors, no streetlights, just a pitch-black wall of pines swallowing the property. When I pulled into the driveway at dusk, Mrs. Gable, the boy's mother, was in a state of absolute panic. She shoved a thick wad of cash into my hand, constantly checking her watch and darting her eyes toward the windows. She frantically explained she had a sudden, unavoidable business trip, and I needed to watch her 7-year-old son, Toby, until noon the next day. "He's a good kid, just a bit quiet. Don't force him to talk," she fired off like a machine gun, grabbing a large suitcase and rushing toward the door. "The fridge is full. Keep the front door deadbolted. Do not open the door for anyone, no matter what." Before I could ask a single question, she started her car and sped off into the descending fog. I turned back inside to face Toby. The scrawny 7-year-old, wearing oversized gray pajamas, stood perfectly still at the bottom of the stairs. He didn't cry when his mom left, nor did he greet me. His eyes held an eerie, cold emptiness, unlike any child I had ever met. Throughout the evening, the atmosphere in the house grew thick and suffocating. Toby didn't play with toys, didn't watch TV, and completely ignored the spaghetti I cooked for him. Instead, he performed a routine that made my skin crawl. He walked around the house, slowly and methodically checking every single window latch. He pulled the blinds, checked the front door deadbolt, then circled back to the patio door. "What are you looking for, Toby?" I tried to sound friendly. He didn't look at me, his tiny hand still rubbing the heavy brass lock. "Mom said to lock it tight, or the boogeyman will get in." I let out a nervous laugh, writing it off as the overactive imagination of a sensitive kid, or maybe some OCD stemming from his parents' recent divorce, something Mrs. Gable had briefly mentioned. I tucked him into bed at 9 p.m., lingered to read him a short story, and retreated to the guest room at the end of the hall. As the night truly set in, the glass house revealed its terrifying isolation. There was no traffic, no ambient city noise. The silence was so profound, I could actually hear the blood pumping in my ears. Occasionally, the house settling as the temperature dropped, and the wind howling through the massive pines made me jump. I turned off the lamp, pulled the heavy duvet up to my chin, and forced myself to sleep. I don't know how long I was out. A freezing draft sweeping across my face jolted me awake. The room was pitch black. I blinked, trying to orient myself, and then my heart practically stopped beating. The guest room door, which I had left slightly ajar, was now standing wide open. Standing right at the foot of my bed, as motionless as a statue, was a tiny silhouette. It was Toby. I opened my mouth to call his name, but the sound caught in my throat as the pale moonlight from the window illuminated exactly what he was holding. It was a massive, razor-sharp meat cleaver. taken straight from the kitchen block. He was gripping the heavy handle with both hands, the blade pointing toward the floor. He wasn't looking at me. His dead, hollow eyes were wide open, locked onto the pitch-black hallway behind him. Absolute paralyzing panic washed over me. My mind raced through horrific news articles about disturbed children attacking their babysitters. I slowly sat up, a cold sweat soaking through the back of my shirt. "Toby," I whispered, my voice trembling uncontrollably. "Put that down, sweetie. Give me the knife." He didn't even blink. He slowly raised a single finger to his pale lips, signaling me to be quiet. "Shh," Toby whispered, his voice chillingly calm. "Don't make a sound. Daddy's home." My blood ran completely cold. Daddy? Mrs. Gable said she was divorced and had full custody because her ex-husband was violently abusive. And right at that exact moment, I heard it. Breaking the dead silence of the house was a sharp metallic sound from the ground floor. Click. A key sliding into the front door lock, followed by the heavy brass deadbolt being smoothly turned. Creak. The front door opened. Mrs. Gable didn't have an emergency business trip. The sheer panic, the triple pay, the strict instructions to lock the house down. None of it was to protect her son. She knew her violent ex-husband, who had likely just gotten out of jail or violated a restraining order, was on his way here. She had fled, leaving the lights blazing, my car parked in the driveway, and a stupid 19-year-old girl in the house as a decoy, a human shield to trick that sadistic man into thinking everything was perfectly normal. The 7-year-old boy holding a cleaver at the foot of my bed had no intention of hurting me. He had lived through enough trauma to know he had to arm himself the second he heard his father's truck pull up to the edge of the woods. He was protecting himself, and probably me too. The sound of heavy leather boots began thudding up the wooden stairs. Thump, thump, thump. He wasn't rushing. He walked slowly, rhythmically, like a hunter savoring the fear of trapped prey. Pure survival instinct took over. I shot out of bed, lunged forward, and scooped Toby up. He was terrifyingly light and freezing cold. I yanked him back, slammed the guest room door shut, and threw the lock. The exact second the lock clicked, the footsteps in the hallway stopped dead. He was standing right on the other side of the door. Just a few inches of flimsy wood separated us. There was no yelling, no threats. He just tried the knob. When he felt it was locked, I watched the doorknob slowly, methodically twist back and forth. Trembling violently, I held Toby tight against my chest with one arm, using my other to frantically pull out my phone and dial 911. But when I looked at the glowing screen, utter despair crushed me. No service. We were too deep in the Tillamook forest. Crash! The door violently shuddered. He had started ramming his shoulder into the wood. The hinges shrieked in protest. I knew the door wouldn't last another 60 seconds. Without thinking, I carried Toby to the window, unlatched it, and shoved the heavy glass pane up. Directly below was the sloped roof of the attached garage. I pushed Toby out first, then climbed out after him, sliding down the slick, wet shingles into the thick, freezing fog. Just as I swung my legs over the edge and dropped onto the soaking wet grass below, I heard the bedroom door splinter and cave in. We didn't run toward my car. He had blocked the driveway. I grabbed Toby's hand and sprinted blindly into the pitch-black pine forest. The freezing fog cut into my skin, and unseen branches tore at our arms and legs, but I didn't dare stop. We hid under a massive, moss-covered hollow log for 6 agonizing hours, shivering and holding each other in absolute silence until dawn broke and a park ranger patrol finally drove by. The police later found the man sitting casually in the living room, drinking Mrs. Gable's liquor with a hunting shotgun resting on his lap. He thought I was his wife. If Toby hadn't woken me up that night, I probably would never have seen the sunrise. To this day, I have entirely sworn off babysitting. But the thing that haunts me the most isn't the sound of that door being rammed in the dark. It's the sheer, cold-blooded cruelty of a mother, a woman willing to abandon her own 7-year-old flesh and blood and throw a teenage stranger to the wolves just to buy herself enough time to escape. I was 22. My sister Sarah and her husband Mark had just moved to an exclusive, highly secluded gated community called Pine Valley Estates, nestled at the foot of a snow-capped mountain range in Colorado. It was the kind of neighborhood where people proudly bragged, "We don't even need to lock our doors here." The massive houses were spread far apart, surrounded by towering pines, creating a sense of peace that felt almost surreal. During winter break that year, my sister and brother-in-law decided to celebrate their anniversary at a resort a 3-hour drive away. Naturally, I was asked to watch my niece and nephew, 5-year-old Lily and 8-year-old Sam. Sarah left me a long list of emergency contacts, reminded me to keep the heat on, and mentioned that Lily sometimes suffered from nightmares. The evening went perfectly smoothly. We ate pizza, watched cartoons in the massive living room, and by 9 p.m., I took the kids upstairs to bed. The siblings' rooms faced each other across a long, thickly carpeted hallway, while my guest room was all the way down on the ground floor. Once the kids were asleep, I brewed myself a cup of hot tea and curled up on the large sofa. That's when I began to feel the terrifying emptiness of the house. In expensive suburban communities like this, the silence has a physical weight to it. No traffic, no barking dogs, no human sounds piercing the thick, soundproof glass windows. The only sounds were the steady hum of the refrigerator and the occasional scraping of dry pine branches against the roof tiles whenever the north wind blew. Around 10:30 p.m., the soft padding of bare feet on the wooden stairs shattered the dead silence. I looked up to see Lily standing on the bottom step, clutching her sweat-soaked teddy bear. Her face was pale, her eyes red and watery. "Lily, why aren't you asleep?" I set my tea down and hurried over. "Auntie," her voice trembled, barely a whisper. "Tell the man to leave." My spine turned to ice. "What man, Lily? It's just you, me, and Sam in the house." "The man standing in the corner of my room," Lily sniffled, pointing upstairs. "He just stands in the dark. He told me to close my eyes and go to sleep, and he would watch over me." My brain immediately tried to rationalize it. 5-year-olds have incredibly vivid imaginations, especially when sleeping in massive rooms with lots of shadows. Remembering Sarah's warning about nightmares, I took a deep breath, forced a smile, and picked her up. "That's just the shadow of the tree outside your window, sweetie. Let's go up and check together." I carried Lily back to her room. Flipping the light switch on bright, I threw open the closet doors, checked under the bed, and even pulled the curtains back to prove no one was there. Finally, Lily settled down. I tucked her in, left her door slightly ajar, and turned on the hallway nightlight before tiptoeing downstairs. Even though I had reassured myself, I noticed my hands were shaking slightly. I double-checked the front door deadbolt, still locked tight. I walked a lap, checking all the ground floor windows. All were securely shut. "You're just scaring yourself," I muttered under my breath. 20 minutes later, just as my heart rate finally settled, footsteps echoed again, but this time, it wasn't a slow, padding walk. It was the frantic, heavy thudding of someone sprinting down the stairs. It was Sam. The 8-year-old was ghost pale, gasping for air, and he threw himself into my arms like a hunted animal. "Auntie! Auntie!" Sam stammered, gripping my shirt tightly. "Calm down, Sam. What's wrong?" I hugged him, feeling his chest heaving violently. He looked up at me, his wide eyes filled with absolute terror. "Why did you come into my room? Why did you stand next to my bed staring at me, and then leave without saying anything?" The blood froze in my veins. Every rationalization about nightmares or imaginations instantly evaporated. I hadn't set foot in Sam's room, and 2 kids of different ages couldn't possibly have the exact same nightmare at the exact same time. Someone was upstairs. Protective instinct surged through me stronger than ever before. I told Sam to sit perfectly still on the sofa and not make a single sound. I walked barefoot into the kitchen and pulled a razor-sharp fillet knife from the block. My grip on the handle was so tight, my knuckles turned white. I began to creep up the stairs. Every step was psychological torture. The house now felt like a giant coffin where every sound was magnified. Reaching the second floor, I peeked down the hallway. Sam's door was wide open, empty. But Lily's door, the door I swore I had left only slightly ajar, was now fully wide open. From my angle in the hallway, I could see the edge of Lily's bed. She was still lying there, buried under her blankets. But right beside her bed, lurking in the darkest corner of the room, was something else. It wasn't a tree shadow, it was a pitch-black silhouette, absurdly tall. The intruder had to be at least 6'5". His head nearly brushed the ceiling chandelier. He stood perfectly motionless, leaning slightly forward, his eyes locked onto the sleeping Lily. My stomach dropped. I wanted to scream, but my throat clamped shut as if invisible hands were choking me. I took a tiny step forward, accidentally making a virtually inaudible creak on the hardwood floor. The massive black figure instantly stopped moving. He didn't turn his head to look at me. Instead, in the chillingly dead silence, he slowly lowered his face right next to Lily's pillow. In a high-pitched, sing-song, androgynous voice, a tone that completely contradicted his massive frame, he whispered, just loud enough to carry out into the hallway, "These kids are special, aren't they?" That sickening voice shocked every nerve in my body like a live wire. The sheer terror transmuted into pure adrenaline. I didn't charge into the room. I knew with that size, he could disarm me and snap my neck in a heartbeat. I spun around and bolted down the stairs at a terrifying speed. I grabbed Sam's hand, dropped the knife, and ran straight for the front door. I threw it open and dragged the boy out into the freezing, snowy night. We ran in our socked feet, stepping onto the biting snow, sprinting across the vast lawn. "But what about Lily?" Sam shrieked as we ran. "I'm going to call the cops. Just keep running," I screamed. I knew if I hesitated, we were all dead. Through the thick fog and falling snow, I looked down the dark, paved road of the community. Every house was pitch black, doors locked tight. Only one house at the corner, about 4 doors down, had its porch lights blazing brightly. I dragged Sam toward it like a madwoman and hammered wildly on the door. Seconds later, it swung open. An older woman with a kind face, wearing a thin cardigan, looked at us in alarm. "Oh my goodness, what happened? Come inside quickly, you'll freeze to death." She hurriedly pulled us into the warm foyer, then quickly slammed the door shut and twisted multiple heavy metal deadbolts. The relief hit me so hard my legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the entryway rug. Please call 911, I sobbed, my entire body shaking uncontrollably. "There's a man in my sister's house. He's in my niece's bedroom." It's all right, sweetie. You're safe now. Let me go grab my phone and make you both some hot cocoa." She gently patted my shoulder, smiled warmly, and turned to walk toward the kitchen. I sat on the floor, clutching Sam tight, gasping for air. The warmth of the house began to soothe my freezing feet, but as my eyes casually drifted toward the hallway leading to the side garage door, my chest suddenly tightened. Tossed carelessly on the welcome mat was a pair of massive rubber snow boots. They were still soaked in mud, and the snow clinging to the soles was actively melting, forming little puddles on the hardwood floor. Someone had just walked into the house not too long ago. Very, very recently. Then, from the deep shadows of the hallway connecting to the garage, heavy footsteps approached. I held Sam tight, holding my breath. A man stepped out of the shadows and into the brightly lit foyer. He was massive, nearly 6'5", wearing a long black coat still dusted with unmelted snowflakes. In his arms, he was carrying Lily. She was either fast asleep or drugged, resting limply in his massive arms. And then, in that same high-pitched, sing-song, sickening voice, he tilted his head and whispered, "I told you, Martha. Keep the lights on and the door unlocked, and they'll come running right to us."